Now came the suitors, young bloods trooping to thrones or easy chairs. Attendants poured water over their fingers while the maids piled baskets full of brown loaves, and houseboys brimmed the bowls with wine. Telemachus now spoke to gray eyed Athena, his head bent close. Dear guest, it is easy for these men to like these things, harping and song. They have an easy life, scot free, eating the livestock of another. Odysseus, a man whose bones are rotting somewhere now, white in the rain, on dark earth where they lie. If he returned, if these men ever saw him, faster legs they'd pray for. But he is lost. He came to grief and perished, and there's no help for us. That sun has long gone down. To this, the gray eyed goddess answered, Mentes I am called. Years back, my family and yours were friends. As for my sailing here, the talk was that your father had come home. Therefore I came. I see the gods delay him. But never in the world is Odysseus dead, only detained somewhere on the wide sea. He will not now be long away from Ithaca. He'll scheme a way to come. He can do anything. So opens the great epic, the Odyssey. The first, and this is the first episode of our new podcast, Luke, Fathers and Sons.
Glad to
It's
hear.
good to be with you. I'm Heath.
And I'm Luke. We're gonna jump into our attempt at trying to understand a little bit more about this great story today. You want me to go ahead and introduce us a little bit, Dad?
Yeah, if you would, just kind of introduce the concept for this podcast that we've been thinking about doing for some time.
Yeah, yeah. So this is our our first foray into the world of podcasting. But we're gonna go ahead and give it our best shot. Um, There's probably a lot about us that'll be pertinent to the podcast, and I think will come up throughout the course of conversation. But for today, I think the most important thing is that we're both fathers and both sons. And I'll add husbands in there, even though it's not part of the title. So I'm a relatively new dad. I have a 3-year-old daughter named River, and have been married for about 6 years. And you have quite a bit more time under your belt. You've got 3 daughters, my sisters, and myself, so 4 kids. And, you and mom have been married, I think, for over 30 years now, right?
They're almost 32.
Man, you guys are getting up there.
Yeah.
So, in any case, for both of us, being fathers, sons, and husbands are definitely, I would say, the most defining characteristics in our lives. And as cliche as it might sound, family and those relationships are the driving force behind our decisions, behind the things we do and believe. So, as we are parenting and being parented and living in this modern age, I feel like so many of the big questions I have are being answered by studies and by statistics. When to put your kids to bed, how much to feed them, how to make sure you have good relationships, all that kind of stuff. So, as much as we are fans of critical thinking and evidence-based approaches, no shade on that lifestyle. There are, I think, big questions out there that don't necessarily have scientific answers or even rational ones.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do is explore those questions using some other methods. The methods of the ancients, stories, literature, history, art. Really, what we're doing is we're going to be asking maybe a couple of questions in each of these episodes and trying to answer them using stories, movies, things that we know relatively well.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that we'd like to try to explore in these episodes are the great stories that we have heard. And some of these stories our listeners will be very familiar with. Our first episode this week, we're going to look at the Odyssey. And of course, as we were talking about before we hit record, we have way more material than we can probably get through in a little bit less than an hour, which is going to be kind of our sweet spot for these episodes just related to the Odyssey. We could talk for a long time about this. And then, we've got some other really cool episodes planned about stories people will have heard about. We're going to talk some Shakespeare. We're going to talk some Disney stories. We're going to talk about some stories from American history and from other, historical examples that people will have heard. But then we're going to talk about some stories people will not have heard about, some from our own family history, and then some less well known fathers and sons from both pop culture and literature and history that we think illustrate some of these broad questions and look at what it can teach us about how to be effective fathers, but also, good men and have good impacts and positive impacts on our societies today.
Yeah. Maybe a couple of quick notes there. We have decided to focus primarily on stories about men, fathers, and sons, because that's where we have the most expertise, but that may change in the future. And we're definitely open to suggestions from any listeners out there if there's things they think might be important. And then one other piece, we're both coming from a background of faith, specifically as practicing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we will definitely have our biases and assumptions based off those beliefs. And we are happy to have our ideas and thoughts challenged by anyone who decides to listen. But definitely looking forward to this.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's kind of launch into our topic for today, which is the Odyssey. And specifically, we're going to talk about the relationship in the Odyssey between, of course, the main character, the titular character, Odysseus, and his son, Telemachus. And we're going to explore kind of several main questions today.
Mhm.
Um, what does the relationship between Odysseus and Telemachus have to say about fathers and sons today? What happens when fathers are absent for long periods of time, whether it be physically or emotionally? And
Yeah.
how do fathers and sons sort of, deal with that kind of absence? How can they repair either damage or the effects of absences like that? And then maybe a bit about how fathers and particularly sons come to know their fathers, and whether that's even fully possible. And we'll maybe posit a couple of questions along that line.
Yeah.
Sound okay?
Sounds like a plan. I do really think that this is a big question. I kind of a tongue in cheek idea, but Odysseus, spoiler alert, is gone for 20 years and
Yeah,
comes home. And it seems implausible at best that he could have a good relationship with his son, but we'll see what happens there. So,
yeah.
title question: can you leave for 20 years and still be a good dad?
Yeah. Okay. We've got to kind of set the scene. One of the fun things about this podcast is getting to go back and read and review some stories that we've maybe read before or heard before, but maybe forgotten. And so we went back and I think we kind of speed read parts of the Odyssey. And so the version that I read, I'll just give a good shout out, was the Fitzgerald translation, which is really good. There are a number of these. So most of us remember from junior high or high school or even college reading the Odyssey, and probably most people remember like the adventure part.
Yeah,
Um, the o- eh,
I had an abridged version when I was in, I think, in 5th grade. And I still remember the cover. It has a picture of Odysseus at the prow of his ship with a sword fighting, I don't know, Scylla or Charybdis, one of the sea
right,
monsters, and there's tentacles, and the abridged version's great because it's all the action stuff.
yeah, yeah. So the Odyssey is sort of the sequel to the Iliad, where the
Mm,
Iliad is the Trojan War, and they're in Troy, and they fight this 10-year long war. So Odyssey's gone for 10 years during the Trojan War, and then the Odyssey covers about 10 years as well. And we remember sort of the adventure with the Cyclops and Scylla and Charybdis and the clever gambit to be able to hear the siren song while his crew puts wax in their ears and he gets tied to the mast and all of that. But there's a whole separate, and it's actually more than half of the book, um, actually focuses on the home front. Odysseus's wife, Penelope, who is at home in Ithaca in Greece, in the western part of Greece, and she is being besieged by a literal army of suitors who are sort of saying, your husband is dead. You need to choose a new husband to become king of Ithaca. And then Odysseus's son, who was a baby when he left, is coming of age, and his name is Telemachus. And in fact, the first 4 books of the Odyssey are called the Telemachy, because they sort of deal with Telemachus's coming of age and his grappling with the absence of his father, and can he grow into the man who can defend the kingdom of Ithaca against these suitors.
Mhm.
So in fact, that's one of the main themes of the book is he can't. He cannot do it, at the beginning. He is young, he's probably 18, maybe 20. He's too weak, he has no experience, he's never been to war, so he can't do it. So, enter Athena. Athena is one of the Greek gods, she's a goddess, and she has a special place in her heart for Odysseus, and that goes all the way back to the Trojan War. So Athena comes to Ithaca disguised as somebody named Mentes, and encourages Telemachus to go in search of his father. And so that's one of the
Mhm.
great sort of themes of the book is Telemachus' search for his father. And I'm sure we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe one quick thing about the
yeah.
search, moniker that you gave that. It's
Yep.
more than just a physical search, right? It's kind of a metaphysical, spiritual he's trying to not only find out where Odysseus is, but understand him.
For sure.
He doesn't remember his father at all. He was a baby when Odysseus left. I believe Telemachus means distant war in
I
Greek,
think that's
and
right.
Penelope names Telemachus essentially after this endeavor that, after, the war in Troy because Odysseus is gone. Um, and there's a point at which Athena is talking to Telemachus right at the beginning, and she says to him, "The son is rare who measures with his father,
Yeah.
and one in 1,000 is a better man." Basically, kids don't usually live up to their parentage. Um, and so I feel like that overshadows this whole part you're about to describe, where Telemachus is searching for his dad. He's like, "I want to be like my dad. My dad's this legendary figure." Athena loves him because he's the smartest man who ever lived. He's a trickster. He's the guy
He's
who,
clever. He's
yeah, he's
clever, right?
clever. He's the
Yeah.
guy who invented the Trojan horse,
Right.
who came up with the Trojan horse and won the war for the Greeks.
Yeah.
So Telemachus' search for Odysseus is both a physical search trying to find his dad to get help with these knuckleheads that are bugging his mom, but it's
Yeah.
also his attempt to reconcile his current identity with the legacy, with the shadow that's cast by Odysseus.
Yeah, and I think, we'll talk about this a little bit more as we come to it, but, he has to decide whether he's gonna be loyal to his father.
Mhm.
Spoiler alert, his dad does come back, right?
Yep.
And he's gonna have to make some decisions because his father coming back introduces a whole raft of conflicts and other decisions for Telemachus, and he's going to have to decide whether he's going to display that filial loyalty. And where does that filial loyalty come from? And in part, it sort of begins with this search. And
Yeah,
I imagine he's wondering, why has my father been away for
I'm
so long?
sure. I can't imagine he wasn't, you know?
Exactly. Why did he have to go? Right. So Telemachus goes first to Pylos, to an old wise warrior named Nestor. And Nestor is he was old and wise during the Iliad, during the Trojan
Mhm.
War. He was kind of the old sage. And so Nestor knew his father, and he goes there and he hears about uh, just exactly what you're saying, Luke, how crafty and wily Odysseus was and how his exploits helped win the war. But there's interesting thing that Nestor says, how much Telemachus reminds Nestor of Odysseus. And he says that repeatedly. So Telemachus starts to sort of see himself in the role of this legacy that you're talking about. Then he also goes to Menelaus. Menelaus is the husband of Helen. Our listeners may remember the name Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. She was sort of
Yeah.
The cause, I mean, you get into feminist critical theory here. The cause of the Trojan War, Paris, the Prince of Troy, um, sort of abducted, or Helen went with him to Troy, and that's what caused the Trojan War. And so she was married to Menelaus, and so they had come back to Sparta after the Trojan War, and so Telemachus goes to Sparta, and he also hears about his father's great reputation as a warrior and as a strategist. And again, he hears that he reminds Menelaus uh, uh, of of Odysseus, and with the way he speaks, and in particular his oratory is compared to Odysseus.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, Odysseus has a silver tongue. He uses his craftiness. That's a major theme throughout is his ability to talk his way out of problems that
That's
other
right.
men might not be able to.
That's right. On these journeys, here's a little bit, Telemachus hears a little bit about Odysseus. Not that he's for sure alive, but that he's been sighted, and maybe he's alive, and maybe he's on his way back, and he's been sighted pretty recently. And so maybe there's some hope that he's coming back. He gains a little bit of confidence, and he decides to go back to Ithaca and to make a stand against these suitors, and to protect his mother. Um, Meanwhile, the story goes back then and switches back to Odysseus, and we find that he is a prisoner on the island of Calypso. And Calypso is a nymph. She's a goddess. She really likes him, and she wants him to stay there. He's been there for 7 years. So, like, 7/10 of the length of the Odyssey is spent on Calypso's island. But he can't leave, but he wants to leave. And this is where we learn that he really does pine for his sort of hearth and home.
Yeah.
I'm going to see what you make of this quote, Luke. So this is what Calypso offers to Odysseus, basically immortality, and says, "You can stay here with me, and you can become a god." Basically, all you have to do is give up this silly, mortal, short-sighted wish to go back to your wife. I mean, why would you want to do that? Look at me, right? And he says, "My lady goddess, here is no cause for anger. My quiet Penelope, how well I know, would seem a shade before your majesty." So he's comparing, Penelope, who's his wife, to this goddess. "Death and old age being unknown to you, while she must die. Yet it is true. Each day I long for home, long for the sight of home." What do you make of that?
I think there's so much there that we could talk about. But I wanted to focus though on what you said about her offer. So she's basically offering to be, his wife now and offering him immortality to become a god,
Yeah,
which, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, is sort of the highest honor. It's something that people aspire to. The Disney movie Hercules kind of does this trope where Hercules is offered godhood, but he wants to stay with his love. It's something the Percy Jackson series does this same thing. The gods offer Percy Jackson immortality, but he chooses
right.
to stay with his friends. It's very common. But I think it's very interesting in our discussion of fatherhood and husbandhood, because to me one of the major facets to being a good dad is just showing up. And this is, I think, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to say with so much time and cultural distance between us and Odysseus, but I think this is him demonstrating that principle to some extent. A reunion with your kid or with your family, and having given up so much to make that reunion happen, is a demonstrated emphasis on responsibility. And I don't think you can be a good dad without that. I think you
Yeah.
have to demonstrate that you're willing to sacrifice. I think you have to sacrifice. I think that's the first and like the biggest thing that I would try to recognize.
So there's some interesting potential parallels, I think, in the life of a father today. We live in a world that often requires a lot professionally,
Mhm.
right? It might not require you to be away from your family for 20 years or 7 or whatever. It may not require you to be in a situation exactly like this where you're choosing between an immortal goddess and going back to your family. That's, of course, the the plot device here. But I do think that men, women as well, but men, in my experiences, you're faced with choices on a daily basis. Um, how to manage your time, whether to take a job that pays more but will take you away from your family more, whether to take that additional client, whether to take that job that's going to get you the next promotion. Those kinds of decisions. And I can't say what specific choice is right in each case. I think those cases are, those choices are case by case choices. But I do think, you have to balance those things. What I can say though is that throughout your life, you have to recalibrate, right? You have to be willing to recalibrate. And when you get off track, when things get out of balance, you have to be willing to say, things are out of balance. I'm at my sort of calypso moment.
Yeah.
I have to put things back into balance. I have to say, my quiet Penelope, you know, I really, really need to go home. And whether that's on a weekly basis, whether that's on a daily basis, whether you set, I got to go home at 5:30, or whatever it is, whatever there are seasons in every working professional's life when you just have to pay the price and you have to do the things that are necessary, but then you have to recalibrate. And I've had that definitely. I've faced that many times in my life.
Yeah, I love that. You know, my in my home life right now, my wife, as you know, is in graduate school and she's away from home a lot. She's studying to be a physician assistant, and that's been very difficult on our family, very hard for her to be gone so much. But I think, in a similar vein to what you're talking about, it also begs the question, what is worth leaving for?
Yeah.
And not necessarily for 20 years or for months at a time, but in this, the exact same thing you're talking about. Sometimes, as providers for a family, you do have to give up time with your family in order to provide for and protect them. I mean, if I had my wish, I would just stay home and hang out with my daughter all day, but I can't. Um, so I was thinking about this with Odysseus as well. Like, why did he leave, and was it justified? And the answer is, he leaves for a blood oath and for honor. He has promised to support the kings in their war in Troy. We talk a lot about, or we've heard and read a lot about honor and glory, not glory, but honor and loyalty.
And I think
Uh,
glory is part of
uh,
it, Luke,
I
especially
I
in
agree.
Greek culture.
I definitely agree, but I guess what I meant there is that those two things are separate. I think honor and glory are separate ideas, and to me, the honor piece of it is honor is sort of the piece that holds society together.
Mhm.
If we had to equate it to something today, it would be freedom or the Constitution or democracy. We have things today that hold our society together. And I do think those are valid, kind of valuable um, pursuits. And even more granular in like an individual's life, there are things that hold together the family and the home. You have to make enough money to put bread on the table.
Yeah.
You have to fulfill your responsibilities. You have to make sure your, yard is not completely overgrown with weeds. You gotta mow the lawn on Saturdays sometimes. So there are these things that hold life together, and I think those, in most cases, are valid reasons. Again, you have to do this case by case, but those can be valid reasons to sacrifice some of the time that you might be able to spend with your kids. But the flip side of it, the glory side, that might be where it gets dangerous.
Yeah.
And we see that a little bit. I don't know if you wanted to touch on this at all, but part of Odysseus's journey home, there's a couple of points where they kind of could have gotten home, but his sailors and his crew, and even him to some extent, try to find more gold or more glory, and it
Or
pushes
more
them
cattle.
away, or more cattle, and it
Yeah.
pushes them again away from home.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and we won't go too much into the part of the Odyssey where, they're having the actual adventures, but, there are some real themes about greed, in the Odyssey. And about the spirit of adventure, which is, I think, in general a positive thing. I
Yeah,
think
I
people
agree.
having that spirit of wanting to explore and experience things and see over the horizon, that has moved civilization forward. It has resulted in a lot of innovation and a lot of progress, and an enhanced standard of living for all of us. At the same time, there is a personal, trade-off, and individuals who value family and who value being, with their children and being with their spouse have to make those determinations. And, the specific case that I'm thinking about is when they're on the island and they eat the cattle of Helios, the sun. That is what runs afoul of Poseidon, and that is what gets them shipwrecked and kills all of Odysseus's sailors, and that's why he is delayed so long and shipwrecked on the island with Calypso. So there are these sort of moral kind of, symbolic consequences that happen throughout the Odyssey that he has to grapple with. There's an old TV series that I think they're making a remake of, Little House on the Prairie, and you know it well.
Yep.
It's one of your mom's favorites, one of my favorites.
I can hear the theme music in my head as we're
Yeah.
talking about it. Mom used to fold laundry to that show all the time.
And, as a dad, I often would think about, like, what would Charles Ingalls do in this situation? Because,
It's a
like,
good one.
Charles Ingalls was, like, the gold standard. He
Yeah.
would he would often he was kind of a hothead, right? So he would often do the wrong thing at first, but then he would fix it and he would do the right thing. But I would often think about what Charles Ingalls would do, and I remember one episode where, he was a farmer, and they had their land and their farm. But there was one episode or one season where things had gone really poorly and their harvest was really bad, and he had to leave the family and he had to go off and hire himself out as a farmhand. He and what's his name? The guy who played football for the Rams that became an actor. I can't remember his name. The tall
No
guy.
idea.
Anyway, they went off and they found work in other towns, and they were gone for a long time, and they would write home. And I remember, as a young father, thinking about that and thinking, what would I do if I had to do that? And, I've been blessed to be able to support our family, to go to school and become a lawyer, become a diplomat, and mostly we've been together. But there have been times when I've had to travel and I've
Yeah.
had to I've had to be away, and mom and I have had to be separated. We've had to grapple with that. I think those are individual decisions, and they're decisions that you have to make based on good communication between husband and wife, and to the extent appropriate, the children. But then you also have to be ready to recalibrate. And when you have realized you're on the island of Calypso and it's time to go home, you are there at, 8:30 at night working on something, and you need to get home before your kids go to bed. You go home, right? When you have that impression, you go home, or you need to set it aside so you can be at your kid's baseball game or whatever it is, whatever the example is. You have to take those moments and recalibrate and make those sacrifices at work, even though maybe there's an argument, professionally you shouldn't. I guess that's a long way of saying making that point.
Yeah. No,
Huh.
I love that. And I think I think there is a personality trait that might be pertinent there that I think we're gonna get into in just a second. So, do you wanna tell us what happens after the island of Calypso?
Yeah. Okay. So he leaves. and he goes and he gets home and he gets to Ithaca and he has a little bit of help. We won't go into too much detail, but he comes home in disguise. He disguises himself. We're talking about Odysseus here as a beggar. And the first person he meets is a swineherd. And one of the early people he meets is Telemachus. And he reveals himself in due course to Telemachus. And the reunion is pretty emotional. And like when you read this, it could go either way. When you're reading the text, you wonder kind of how it will go because of Telemachus's uh, experiences and the stress that is on him due to the suitors, and frankly, the the fact that the kingdom of Ithaca is in a very precarious situation. It's very precarious, but for whatever reason, Telemachus sees his filial duty very clearly to support his father. And so there's just a quick quote. Throwing his arms around this marvel of a father, Telemachus began to weep. Salt tears rose from the wells of longing in both men, and cries burst from both as keen and fluttering as those of the great talented hawk. So this is a very moving but also manly reunion. Did you want to say something about the film?
Yeah, so well, I can talk about that in a second, but the I think this is a really interesting reunion. I just wanted to say one thing about his beggar disguise. So
Yeah.
we were talking about how they, you have to recalibrate, you have to decide when enough is enough. But to do that takes quite a bit of humility. You have to be able to recognize that you are not perhaps the greatest person in the world and that you have limited time, limited attention, limited energy. You can't do everything. I think it's so interesting that Odysseus comes home as a beggar first. I mean, he's the
Mhm.
king. And there are moments in this story. The one that's coming to mind is when he blinds Polyphemus, the Cyclops, where he escapes. And at first, he tells the Cyclops he's nobody. But as he's escaping, he yells back to shore, I am Odysseus. Odysseus is the one who has outsmarted you and blinded you.
Yeah.
And so there are moments where he is so full of himself. Odysseus is just, he's so full of pride. And they're generally quite punishing. That is another moment where he's punished by Poseidon because Polyphemus is Poseidon's son. And Polyphemus tells his dad, Odysseus blinded me. You got to get revenge. Anyway, I think it's telling that he's come home and decided to be a beggar. He's gone through this whole journey. And this is something I've talked to you about before, but I see the Odyssey. There's a big part of it that's Telemachus's coming of age story, but I also feel in some ways that it's Odysseus's coming of age story. And a big lesson he learns over the course of this whole process is humility, and that the gods are the ones who are going to, make or break him, and he can't do everything alone. So he dresses up as a beggar. And I think if I were Telemachus, that would be a very important factor in my acceptance of my father. This man comes home after 20 years. If he had come in, pomp and circumstance, trumpets blowing behind him, and said, I'm the king, I'm your dad, welcome me, I'm the best, that would have gone over quite differently than him coming to me as a beggar and
Mm.
saying, I've missed you, son, I love you, and I'm glad to see you.
Yeah. That's interesting. In some ways, I don't know if you've seen. I think we talked about this. The recent version of this part of the Odyssey, "The Return" by the and
Ralph Fiennes, right?
right, Ralph Fiennes' Odysseus, and I forget who is Telemachus, but he plays the part as sort of an angry young man who is really doesn't understand his father's absence. And Ralph Fiennes plays Odysseus as a very battle weary, sort of almost PTSD affected veteran who comes back um, and the beggar disguise almost doesn't seem like a disguise. It almost seems like
Interesting.
that's who he is. And so that kind of leads into some of the questions I have about um, the relationships between fathers and sons. I mean, sometimes, after a long absence, or not even an absence, but sometimes, relationships between fathers and sons are damaged, and then there's an attempt at reconciliation. And, it's hard to accept one another as, sort of who we are. Telemachus would have heard all of these stories about how wonderful his dad was, right? And what a great warrior he was and how clever he was. And Athena said, "Your dad can do anything, basically. He'll don't worry, he'll make it. He can do anything." But then faced with the man himself, there's bound to be disappointment. And as you grow and mature as a son, you recognize your father has flaws, has weaknesses, has limitations. So I wonder if that is in some ways what is being explored there as well.
Well, the story that comes to mind for me is the prodigal son, and this is, I think, a favorite of mine and of yours as well. It's interesting to consider it in the light of the Odyssey because in this scenario, Odysseus is the prodigal. He's the
Yeah.
prodigal father. He's been away, he's been buffeted and beaten by life, and he's come home. And his son has every right to be angry.
Mhm.
There's a line in this book where Telemachus talks about how he doesn't even know what his father looks like.
Yeah.
And
Would he
I
even
think
know
about
him if
that.
he saw him?
Yeah, exactly. And I think about that. I mean, he doesn't know him when he sees him.
Right.
He sees him and has no idea who this guy is. And as soon as he says, I'm your father," I mean, it's literally the prodigal son. He throws himself upon his neck and kisses him, and
Mhm.
they weep, right? Um, I think I take well, I take issue a little bit with the angry Telemachus because I think this is a really cool story of forgiveness and hope. And I think one of the major aspects of this is that when Odysseus comes home, his instinct is not to sit around and either complain about what's happened to him, and it's also not to sit around and kind of reminisce. His immediate course of action is action. And I don't know, maybe you were going to tell us a little bit about this, but like on the same page that he and Telemachus reunite, their immediate uh they immediately begin planning for war.
Yeah.
And he includes Telemachus in that as kind of a co-general, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. So I think you were going to talk about that. Do you want to tell us a little bit what happens there?
Yeah, so, I mean, they immediately, upon I mean, they're basically in the herd's shack.
Yeah,
They're
in the
not back
dark.
at the palace yet. They're in these sort of rough circumstances, and they start, to plan to retake the castle,
Mhm.
essentially. And they have, like, 3 guys,
They're storming the castle. It's
right?
the
And
Prince of Pride.
this is where Telemachus, who again, remember, is young and inexperienced, and he has all the will in the world, but he doesn't have the experience.
Yeah, he's
Um,
unblooded, right?
he basically says, "I've heard about your fame and your skill in battle all my life, but what you speak is a staggering thing. How can 2 men do battle with a houseful in their prime?" He's talking about the suitors, right? It's
There's like
basically an
100 of
army.
them.
There's over 100 suitors,
Yeah.
but they hatch a plan, and they do have a few loyal servants, and Odysseus has an unshakable sort of confidence in himself. Um,
He
and
has
then
let me add
go
one thing there.
go ahead.
He has unshakable confidence in himself, yes, but he also there's a quote that I love. It's just 2 lines, but he's talking to Telemachus, and he's telling Telemachus his duties, and you may read something that's a little bit before this, but he says, "Put aside 2 broadswords and 2 spears for our own use, 2 ox-hide shields nearby." And then so first of all, I don't know, I love that. Like,
Yeah,
"Get the stuff ready, man, we're gonna do this." He has
and
faith in Telemachus. Put
and 2.
2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, And he also says, "Count up the suitors for me. Let me know what men at arms there are, how many men. I must put all my mind to it to see if we too can take them on."
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's like, he's kind of revving Telemachus up. He's like, "Get some stuff. We're gonna do this." But then he also says, "Athena and Zeus will see you through." And this kind of goes a little bit back to that humility piece. This is a lesson that Odysseus has learned, and he's relied on Athena a lot, but um, he has faith in something that's a little bit greater than himself. So I think that that would be a really important thing for Telemachus to see. And, his dad believes in him. His dad believes in the gods. His dad believes in himself, and he's ready to go. He says, "We can do this."
It's interesting. It, what a contrast to the treatment that Telemachus has received at the hands of the suitors
Yeah.
who have
Hmm.
ridiculed him as this sort of pampered, ineffective, princeling who has absolutely no power and no ability to do anything about it as they eat him out of house and home, and basically threaten and basically let him know that as soon as one of them marries his mother, his days will be numbered. And there's a few interactions with the various suitors that are extremely threatening to Telemachus and undervalue and make him feel like he has no power, right? And so, he goes. Athena basically says, "Go in search of your father." So he goes to these trusted men who knew his father. He learns a little bit of his father. Finally, he meets his father, and his father then sort of puts this level of confidence upon him and gives him this level of responsibility, right?
Yeah, yeah, he moves from a legacy and a myth into a man of flesh and blood who is happy to see him, loves him, and believes in him. Like, he
Yeah,
checks all the boxes I think you need to check if you're
that's right.
coming home from a long absence.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, of course, there's the part of the plan that relies upon, Odysseus's cunning as well, not just his battle prowess. So he
Mhm.
goes to the palace in his beggar, costume. He tells Telemachus, "Allow the suitors to abuse me. Whatever you do not object. Let them abuse me. In fact, the more the better. That will get them comfortable. That will, let them think I'm not a threat. And that is when we will strike, is when they are most sort of, disarmed by the fact that I'm just this harmless beggar." And then just to kind of round out the plot, Penelope at this time has decided there's this whole plot about this tapestry, I think, or it's actually a shroud for Odysseus's father. And she has put off the suitors with this ruse of her own. She's actually a perfect match for Odysseus because she's very crafty as well. She's put off the suitors for years by
Yeah.
weaving this shroud and says, "As soon as I'm done with this shroud, I will marry one of you." And at night, she comes back and she takes it apart. And
We
that's
may
when
need to do a we may need to do a follow-up on Penelope and Odysseus
yeah,
relation.
that would be good. That would be good. There's a whole story about the bed and all that stuff, which is really cool. Um, but she decides finally, I have to save the kingdom. So I'm going to choose a suitor, but I'm gonna do it my way, and so she does a test of skill. She announces a test of skill, and it's sort of unclear. By this time, she's met the beggar, who is Odysseus, right? She's met the beggar, and it's a little unclear from the text whether she suspects who he is, but she sets up a test of skill that the one who can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through, I think it's 10 axe heads, right? The axe heads have like a, a, a gap in them, will have her hand. And of course, none of these jokers can do it. The bow is very stiff, and it's Odysseus's long bow. And as a beggar, he says, "Well, do you think I could try?" And they all scoff and think that
Yeah,
that's
they laugh at
hilarious. And of course, he steps into the bow and pulls it across his body and strings up the bow. And of course, there's a scabbard of arrows just there, and that is when he and Telemachus begin the battle because he's armed then, and
Yeah.
Telemachus is armed, and they fight this bloody battle
They
and
kill
conquer.
all the suitors.
Yeah. So so that's how that part of the story ends. It's not the epic continues a little bit further. He actually has an interaction with his own father, which is also interesting. He he is unable to to maintain a disguise. Interestingly enough, when he presents himself to his own father, he tries. He goes to his own father in disguise, and he basically says, "I can't do this. I can't lie to my own father," which I found
Only
interesting.
the only 2 people or the only 2 characters are his father and his dog. I think we have to mention the dog just
Yeah,
briefly.
yeah. Go ahead, tell the story about the dog.
Well, he's walking into his old home still dressed as the beggar, and his old dog, which I mean, this dog's gotta be 25 years old at this point. It's an old dog,
Yeah,
and it can't even, like, stand. It's laying on a heap of trash, basically, but when he walks up, it lifts its head, and it recognizes him. It's such a good part of the book, and I think everybody who talks about the Odyssey talks about it because it's so touching, and then
yeah.
he moves on, and the dog dies. It waited for him to come home.
Having welcomed its master home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so great. So, anyway, his dog and his dad are the 2 that, he can't, hide from.
So Telemachus finds his father, but does he? I read a very interesting book by Daniel Mendelsohn, who is a classicist who has a new translation of the Odyssey, which I've not read that yet. But I read a book about um, his relationship with his own father, who was a mathematician, not a classicist, not a liberal arts guy. And in his father's sort of older years, the age of 81, he had his father come and audit his freshman class on the Odyssey. And it was really an interesting experience for both Daniel Mendelsohn and his father, Jay Mendelsohn.
Mm.
And it helped Daniel get to know his father in a way that he had never known him. But even at the end, he wondered whether he would ever know and whether a son ever could completely know a father. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that question.
I think that's a hard one, and I'm certain is dependent on your relationship, but I think it's also dependent on this question of, like, who really is your father? You know, we're ever evolving beings. In the Iliad, we've talked about this, but Odysseus is often referred to as the son of Laertes. Laertes is his dad, but he refers to himself often in both of these books as the father of Telemachus.
Yeah,
So that's one example of the way that people maybe perceive you differently than you perceive yourself. So when you ask, does Telemachus really find his father? Does he know his father? Does any son know their father? I mean, does any father know themselves? A little
yeah,
bit. There's so many facets to people, and I think maybe, the best we can hope for is that you do get to know your father as your father. You don't have to know him as someone else, but getting to know your father as your father is a
yeah.
gift. I would maybe throw this one back at you though in the opposite question. I watched the 1997 version of the Odyssey with Armand Assant. Um, so
Armando
great.
Sante.
Armand Assante is such a great movie. It's super goofy at some points. Like they show Hermes, and he's basically just this dude painted gold with a diaper, and he's
Yeah,
held up by a pulley system, so he looks like he's about to fall over. It's so funny. But then there's some really intense moments too. Anyway, there's this one point where it's when Achilles is fighting Hector. So it's one of the most intense moments of the Iliad. And Odysseus, there's this whole battle going on, and Odysseus is fighting, and he looks over, and there's a little boy on the battlefield
Mm,
with blood running down his face that's obviously not his. And you've kind of been primed throughout the movie to recognize the look in Odysseus's eyes as, "Oh, that's Telemachus." Like, he sees
mm,
his son in this little boy. So, first of all, this is my favorite way to think about Odysseus as a father and a husband who has been away from home for so long and has been doing everything he can to get home. And when he gets home, it's triumphant and happy and wonderful. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, I wonder, do fathers ever really know their sons? Or do
mm.
they always see them as those little boys? You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. It's a bit of a setup question, but it made me think about being knowable. I think, like you said, it depends upon the relationship, and I think we as fathers, you said something to me one time about being a small father versus a large father or the big
Yeah.
father. I can't remember. You
Yep.
wrote a poem
Yep.
about that. Um, and and I don't know, I mean, I think that means maybe something a little bit different to everybody, but I think what you're trying to capture there is this idea of being involved, in the small things and in the important things in the lives of our children, and being knowable, being accessible
Mhm.
and not being remote. I think that is
Not being
incumbent.
a legend.
Yeah, not being just a myth or a legend. Not every father has that opportunity, right? I mean, and those of us who do, we should take every advantage of it. Your Uncle Quincy has that a saying, windshield time. There's no substitute for windshield time. We should take advantage of that. And now as a grandfather, those moments with your daughter are precious to me, and I try not to be overbearing. Right, I try not to be like, "Hey, do you wanna you wanna talk now?" Um, but
Yeah.
to be knowable for all my flaws and for, as men, we're a mixed bag, but for whatever I can offer, try to be knowable. So, I guess it kind of goes both ways, and I like your question too. Do we take the time to know each other? And I think it comes back to love.
I think so. It's the answer. Love is all you need.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great, Dad, and I think we can probably call it we can end there. Be knowable to your children, return humbly, not as a hero, partner with them, don't just preach, and try your best to be knowable and to know them too.
I like that. So, I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about the Odyssey. Maybe we'll do
Maybe we'll
another
come back
episode.
to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for
Well,
taking us through the story. I think this was fun.
good to talk to you, Luke.
You too. We'll
All right.
see everybody next time.